I never considered myself the romantic type. Sure, I'd been in love before, or at least I thought I had. But at 32, I'd pretty much accepted that my life was going to be a long string of casual dating, late-night takeout, and half-hearted attempts to settle down. My best friend, Kyle, used to joke that I'd end up a professional bachelor, like George Clooney before 'em all. And honestly, I was fine with that. Then came the snowstorm. It was early February, and Chicago was being hit with one of those brutal winter storms that makes you question every decision you've ever made, starting with why you live in the Midwest. I had just finished a miserable day at work. Office politics, missed deadlines, you name it. By the time I walked into the grocery store to grab something for dinner, I was practically a walking icicle. The store was packed. People were panic buying bread and milk like it was the apocalypse. I grabbed a sad-looking rotisserie chicken and was debating whether I cared enough to fight the mob for some side dishes when I heard it. Her laugh. It wasn't loud or obnoxious, but it had this warmth to it, like the sound of someone who had seen the worst life had to offer and decided to laugh anyway. I turned around, and there she was, standing in the baking aisle, holding 2 bags of flour and trying to decide which one to put back. She was wearing this oversized green sweater and a pair of beat-up Converse, and her dark hair was pulled into a messy bun. She didn't look like the kind of woman who usually caught my eye, but there was something about her that made me freeze. Well, that and the fact that she was laughing at herself. What's so funny? I found myself asking before I could think better of it. She glanced up, startled, and then smiled. God, that smile. Oh, nothing. Just realizing I've become the kind of person who panic bakes during storms. I chuckled. Could be worse. At least you're not hoarding Ken's soup. She held up the flour like it was a badge of honor. Guilty as charged. That should have been the end of it. Just a fleeting interaction between 2 strangers in a grocery store. But instead of walking away, I said, "You know, I'm a pretty decent cook. If you're panic baking, maybe I could trade you some actual food for whatever you end up making." She tilted her head, considering. Depends. How good are we talking? Michelin star level, or edible? Somewhere between edible and impressive, depending on the dish. She laughed again. All right, deal. I'm Katie, by the way. Mark, I said. Nice to meet you. We exchanged numbers right there in the baking aisle, which was probably the most impulsive thing I'd done in years. I didn't expect her to actually follow through, but 2 hours later, as the snow piled up outside my apartment, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Katie. Hope you like chocolate chip cookies. By the time she arrived at my place, the storm was in full swing. I opened the door to find her bundled up in a puffy jacket, a Tupperware container clutched in her gloved hands. You made it, I said, stepping aside to let her in. Barely. Your driveway's a death trap, by the way. Noted. She handed me the cookies, and I led her into the kitchen, where I'd managed to throw together a passable chicken parmesan. We ate at my tiny dining table, the wind howling outside, and talked like we'd known each other for years. She told me about her job as a graphic designer, her love of cheesy rom-coms, and how she'd moved to Chicago on a whim after a bad breakup. I told her about my job in marketing, my failed attempt at running a food blog, and my ongoing feud with the guy in 4B over laundry room etiquette. After dinner, we moved to the couch. She curled up under a blanket with a mug of hot cocoa, and I tried not to think about how natural it felt to have her there. At one point, she noticed the guitar leaning against the wall and asked if I played. Not well, I admitted. Prove it. So I did. I played a clumsy version of some old John Mayer song, my fingers freezing up halfway through. She didn't seem to mind. By the time I finished, she was leaning against my shoulder, her eyes half closed. Mark? She murmured. Yeah. I think this is the best first date I've ever been on. I laughed softly. Me too. That night was the start of something I didn't see coming. Over the next few weeks, Katie and I fell into this easy rhythm. We'd cook together, trade movie recommendations, and talk about everything from childhood traumas to our favorite breakfast cereals. She had this way of making even the most mundane moments feel special. Like when she'd sing off-key in the car or insist on dancing in the kitchen while we waited for the pasta to boil. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Katie had her walls, and so did I. She'd been hurt before, and so had I. There were moments when I could see the fear in her eyes, like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. And honestly, I was scared too. Scared of screwing it up. Scared of letting someone in after so many years of keeping people out. Then, one night, everything changed. We were sitting on her couch watching some terrible horror movie when the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment, we just sat there, listening to the storm outside. "Well," she said finally, "this is romantic." I laughed. "I'll grab some candles." By the time I returned, she'd moved closer, wrapping the blanket around both of us. The flickering candlelight made her look almost ethereal, like something out of a dream. She met my eyes, and for the first time I didn't see fear. I saw trust. "Hope." "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm falling for you." My heart skipped a beat. Good, because I'm already there. It's been 2 years since that snowstorm. Katie and I are still together, and every time it snows, we make chocolate chip cookies and laugh about how it all began. I never thought I'd be the kind of guy who believes in fate, but sometimes the universe has a way of surprising you. And sometimes, love shows up when you least expect it, like in the middle of a grocery store during a snowstorm. And for the first time in my life, I'm not scared anymore. You'd think after 2 years, things would settle into some kind of predictable rhythm, but life with Katie was anything but predictable. She had this incredible knack for keeping things fresh, whether it was surprising me with weekend road trips or deciding, on a random Tuesday night, that we absolutely needed to build a blanket fort in the living room. She brought out a side of me I didn't know I had. Before Katie, my life was neat, controlled, and honestly a little boring. I was the kind of guy who set reminders for reminders, who always folded his laundry the same way. But Katie? She was chaos in the best possible way. She didn't just live life. She danced with it, and somehow, she got me to join her. One of my favorite memories was our first big trip together. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway to Wisconsin, but Katie being Katie, it turned into a comedy of errors. First, she booked us a cabin that turned out to be more rustic charm than romantic retreat. We're talking no Wi-Fi, a creaky bed, and a squirrel that seemed way too comfortable raiding the kitchen. "You said you wanted an adventure," she teased as I swatted at the squirrel with a broom. "I meant like hiking, not rabid wildlife." "Don't be such a city boy," she said, laughing as she handed me a cookie. "You'll survive." And I did barely. But by the end of the trip, as we sat by the fireplace, toasting marshmallows on skewers we'd found in a drawer, I realized I didn't care where we were. As long as Katie was there, it felt like home. But it wasn't all marshmallows and blanket forts. Like any couple, we had our rough patches. There was the time I accidentally left her favorite sweater in the dryer and shrunk it to toddler size. Or the time we had our first big fight, over something stupid, of course. I can't even remember what it was about, but I remember the way it felt. Like the air had been sucked out of the room, and we were both too stubborn to fix it. Katie stormed out that night, slamming the door behind her. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the half-empty bottle of wine on the counter, wondering if I just screwed up the best thing that had ever happened to me. When she came back, her cheeks red from the cold, she looked at me and said, "Mark, I don't want to fight with you. But I'm not perfect, and neither are you. So if we're going to do this, we need to figure out how to fight without breaking each other." She was right, of course. She always was. So we talked, really talked, and by the end of the night we were curled up on the couch, holding each other like we were afraid to let go. That was the thing about Katie. She didn't shy away from the hard stuff. She faced it head-on, and she taught me to do the same. Fast forward to last winter. Another snowstorm, another batch of cookies. I'd been planning the moment for weeks, agonizing over every detail. Should I take her to a fancy restaurant? Write her a song? Rent out a movie theater? In the end, I decided to keep it simple. We were sitting on the couch, the smell of cookies filling the air, when I pulled out the little box I'd been hiding in my sock drawer for weeks. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. "Katie," I said, my voice shaky, You know I'm not great with big speeches, but I need you to know something. You've turned my life upside down in the best way possible. You've shown me what it means to really live, to love, and to take chances. And I don't want to do any of it without you. Her eyes went wide as I opened the box to reveal the ring. Will you marry me? For a moment, she just stared at me, her mouth slightly open, and then she laughed. Not a nervous laugh, but that warm, genuine laugh that had hooked me in the grocery store all those years ago. Mark, she said, tears in her eyes. Of course I'll marry you. The next thing I knew, she was in my arms, her lips on mine, and the snowstorm outside might as well have been 1,000 miles away. We got married 6 months later, in a small outdoor ceremony surrounded by our closest friends and family. Katie wore a simple white dress, her hair in loose waves, and I swear she looked like something out of a fairy tale. Kyle, my best man, gave a speech about how he never thought I'd settle down, and everyone laughed when Katie shouted, "Me neither!" Now, as I sit here writing this, I can hear her humming in the kitchen, probably experimenting with some new recipe. Life with Katie is still messy, chaotic, and unpredictable, but it's also beautiful in a way I never knew life could be. Sometimes I think back to that night in the grocery store, when I was just a grumpy guy with a rotisserie chicken and no clue what was coming, and I can't help but smile, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that love doesn't always come when you're looking for it. Sometimes, it finds you in the middle of a snowstorm and changes your life forever. Life after the wedding wasn't a fairy tale. It was better than that. Sure, there were moments when the honeymoon phase faded, and reality crept in. Bills piled up, work stressed us out, and sometimes we bickered about the little things like whose turn it was to take out the trash. But those moments were outweighed by the good ones. Lazy Sunday mornings with pancakes and coffee, impromptu road trips to nowhere, and the way Katie would dance around the kitchen, pulling me into her orbit even when I swore I couldn't dance. A year into our marriage, we decided to take the biggest leap yet. Buying a house. It wasn't fancy. A modest 2-bedroom fixer-upper in the suburbs. But to us, it was perfect. The day we got the keys, Katie insisted on carrying me over the threshold, which resulted in her dropping me onto the hardwood floor and both of us laughing until we couldn't breathe. That house became our project, our labor of love. We spent weekends painting walls, assembling furniture, and arguing over whether to hang art or leave the walls bare. Mark, bare walls are not a design choice, she insisted. There were moments when it felt like we were in over our heads, like the time we tried to install a ceiling fan and ended up short-circuiting the entire second floor. But every misstep brought us closer together, and by the end of it, the house wasn't just a place we lived. It was home. One night, about 2 years after we moved in, I came home late from work to find Katie sitting on the couch, a strange look on her face. Her hands were clasped tightly around a mug of tea, and she was staring at the floor like it held all the answers to the universe. "Katie, everything okay?" I asked, dropping my bag by the door. She looked up, her eyes shining. "Mark, I need to tell you something." My mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. Was she sick? Did she lose her job? Was she unhappy? But before I could spiral any further, she smiled. A small, hesitant smile that made my heart skip a beat. "I'm pregnant," she said softly. For a moment, the world stopped. Pregnant. The word echoed in my head like a song I couldn't get out of my mind. Slowly, I sat down beside her, my hands trembling as I reached for hers. "Are you serious?" I whispered. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I took 3 tests just to be sure. A laugh bubbled out of me, unsteady and disbelieving. "We're gonna have a baby? We're gonna have a baby," she repeated, her voice breaking. I pulled her into my arms, holding her like she might disappear. And for the first time in my life, I cried, not out of sadness or fear, but out of sheer, overwhelming joy. The next 9 months were a whirlwind. Katie handled pregnancy with her usual grace and humor, making jokes about her swollen ankles and craving things like pickles dipped in peanut butter, which, to my horror, she actually enjoyed. We turned the spare bedroom into a nursery, painting the walls a soft gray and assembling a crib that nearly ended our marriage. Who designs these instructions? A sadist. But as the due date approached, the reality of becoming a father hit me like a freight train. What if I wasn't ready? What if I messed it up? I voiced these fears to Katie one night as we lay in bed, the glow of the baby monitor casting soft shadows on the ceiling. "Mark," she said, her voice steady, "you're going to be an amazing dad. You've got the biggest heart of anyone I've ever met, and our baby is so lucky to have you." Her words didn't erase my fear, but they gave me the courage to face it. Because if Katie believed in me, maybe I could believe in myself. Our daughter, Ella, was born on a rainy October morning. Katie was a warrior through it all, her strength and determination leaving me in awe. When they finally placed Ella in her arms, my heart felt like it might burst. She was tiny and perfect, her little fingers curling around Katie's thumb as if she already knew she was safe. From that moment on, everything changed. Sleepless nights and endless diaper changes became our new normal. But so did first smiles, giggles, and the way Ella's tiny hand would clutch mine as she drifted off to sleep. Katie and I weren't just a couple anymore. We were a family, and though it was messy and exhausting and more chaotic than I ever imagined, it was also the most beautiful chapter of my life. Now, as I sit here in the living room, typing this story with Ella asleep in her crib upstairs and Katie curled up beside me, I can't help but feel grateful. Grateful for the snowstorm that brought us together. Grateful for the woman who showed me how to live and love with my whole heart. Grateful for the life we've built. Messy, imperfect, and absolutely ours. And to think it all started with a laugh in a grocery store. As Ella grew, so did our lives in ways I never could have predicted. Parenthood is like this endless series of snapshots. Some you want to frame forever, and some you just hope to survive. There were mornings when Ella would wake us up at 5 a.m., her chubby little hands smacking my face as if to say, "Hey, wake up! Life is happening." There were nights when Katie and I would collapse onto the couch after finally getting her to sleep, too tired to even speak, but somehow feeling closer than ever. One of my favorite memories happened when Ella was about 3. Katie had this idea to take her to a pumpkin patch because, of course, Katie loved everything about fall. The crunchy leaves, the smell of cinnamon in the air, the excuse to wear oversized sweaters. I wasn't sure how much Ella would get out of it, but I went along with it because, well, I'd learned by now that Katie's instincts were usually right. That day was perfect. Ella toddled between the pumpkins, her tiny boots crunching in the dirt, as she proudly picked the ugliest pumpkin she could find. Katie laughed so hard she almost fell over when Ella declared it her friend pumpkin. Later, as the sun set, we sat on a hay bale, Ella nestled between us, clutching her pumpkin like it was a prized jewel. I remember looking at Katie, the golden light catching the strands of her hair, and thinking, this is it. This is what happiness feels like. But life, as it does, threw us a curveball. About a year later, Katie started feeling off. Not sick exactly, but tired in a way that didn't feel normal. She brushed it off at first, blaming it on work or the chaos of raising a toddler. But I could see it in her eyes. She was scared. After weeks of nagging from me, she finally went to the doctor. I stayed home with Ella, trying to distract her with finger paints while my mind raced with all the worst-case scenarios. When Katie walked back through the door that afternoon, her face was unreadable. She sat down beside me, took my hand, and said 3 words I wasn't ready to hear. "I have cancer." I'll never forget the way my heart dropped, like the floor beneath me had disappeared. But before I could fall into the darkness of what that meant, Katie squeezed my hand and said, "It's treatable. I'm going to fight this. We're going to fight this." And fight we did. The months that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Katie went through surgery, then chemo, and the whole time, she was the same Katie I fell in love with. Determined, stubborn, and somehow still managing to crack jokes even on her worst days. We made it a point to keep life as normal as possible for Ella. I'd take her to the park, read her bedtime stories, and remind her every day how much her mommy loved her. Katie, even when she was too weak to get out of bed, would let Ella crawl in beside her, the two of them whispering secrets like they were conspiring against the world. There was one night, after Ella had fallen asleep, when Katie looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling, "promise me that no matter what happens, you'll make sure Ella grows up knowing how much I love her." I choked back my own tears and cupped her face in my hands. "Katie, don't talk like that. You're going to beat this. We're going to grow old together and embarrass Ella at her prom and dance at her wedding." She gave me a weak smile. "You're such a sap. And you love it." Katie did beat it. By some miracle, or maybe just sheer willpower, she came out the other side. The day her oncologist told us she was in remission was the first time in months that I felt like I could breathe again. We celebrated with champagne and cupcakes, the three of us dancing in the kitchen like fools. But something shifted after that. Surviving cancer changes a person, and Katie was no exception. She started talking more about the things she wanted to do, the places she wanted to see, the risks she wanted to take. She signed up for art classes, started volunteering at a local shelter, and even convinced me to take a pottery class with her. Spoiler, I was terrible at it. It was as if she'd been given a second chance at life, and she wasn't going to waste a single moment. Watching her rediscover herself was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. Now, it's been nearly 10 years since that snowstorm, and our lives are fuller than I ever could have imagined. Ella is 8 with Katie's laugh and my stubbornness, and she's already decided she wants to be an astronaut. Katie is cancer-free and thriving, still making me try her weird baking experiments and pulling me into dance parties at random. And me? I'm just a guy who got lucky. A guy who walked into a grocery store one night, cold and miserable, and found the kind of love most people only dream about. A guy who gets to wake up every day next to a woman who's taught me more about life and love and resilience than I ever thought possible. Sometimes, when the house is quiet, I'll look out the window at the snow falling softly on the ground and think back to that night, to the laugh that started it all. And I'll smile, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the best things in life don't come when you're looking for them. They come when you're just trying to buy dinner. Life has a way of surprising you, of pulling you into moments you never expected. It's funny how a random, ordinary decision, like grabbing a rotisserie chicken during a snowstorm, can ripple out into something extraordinary. Today, I'm writing this from the dining room of the same little house Katie and I turned into our home all those years ago. The kitchen is a mess because Ella decided she wanted to bake cookies, just like Mommy used to during snowstorms. Katie's supervising, covered in flour but grinning like she just won the lottery. Our dog, a scrappy mutt named Pumpkin, Ella's idea of course, is lying by my feet, snoring softly. Life isn't perfect. It's messy and unpredictable and sometimes downright hard. But it's ours, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Katie and I still have our moments of chaos because let's face it, she'll always be the whirlwind to my calm. But they're the kind of moments that remind me why I fell in love with her. Like the way she sneaks chocolate chips into my pancakes on Saturday mornings or the way she kisses my forehead when she thinks I'm asleep. It's in the small things, the quiet things, that I've found the truest version of love. Ella keeps us on our toes. She's already smarter than I am and has Katie's stubborn streak, which is a dangerous combination. But she also has the biggest heart of anyone I've ever met. Last week, she brought home a stray cat from the neighborhood and informed us, very seriously, that we now had 2 pets. We named it Stormy because of course it had to be. Katie jokes that we're becoming the family from a cheesy sitcom, and maybe she's right. But if that's the case, I'll take it. Because the truth is, I'm just a guy who got lucky. Lucky to find someone who makes even the ordinary feel magical. Lucky to build a life that's full of laughter and love and the kind of moments you don't realize are the good ones until you're living them. Sometimes, when the house is quiet, I'll sneak outside and sit on the porch, watching the snow fall. I'll think back to that first night in the grocery store, to the way Katie's laugh cut through the noise and wrapped around me like a promise. A promise of something more, something better. And now, years later, I can say this. She kept that promise. Every day, she keeps it. If I've learned one thing in this crazy, beautiful, messy life, it's that love isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as a laugh in a grocery store, a hand reaching for yours in the dark, cookie shared in a storm. And if that's what love is, then I've been the luckiest man alive.